Welcome to Financial Insider Weekly. I'm your host, Michael Gray. My guest today is Bernie Vogel, Bernard Vogel III. Anyway, I've known Bernie since we were children many years ago. Before I get started, I'll apologize a little bit. I've got a little bit of a cold, so it may sound a little foggy to you. Sorry about that, but I think we'll be fine. Anyway, so Bernie is a corporate lawyer, partner at the Silicon Valley Law Group. I guess you're partner in charge now, huh?
I'm the partner in charge.
You have my sympathies.
Thank you.
Anyway, he's worked with that firm since 2000. He has a total of about 28 years of experience as an attorney. Works in the area of corporations, mergers, acquisitions, and finance. And you can tell from Bernie's a pretty fit guy. He's played a number of sports and so forth. Anyway, fun guy to have around. So Bernie, thanks for being my guest here today.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay. Today, Bernie and I are going to be talking about choices of forms for doing business. So we're going to talk about, some of the buzzwords you've heard about: corporations, limited liabilities, companies, and partnerships, and so forth, to help our viewers to understand a little bit about them when they are making some of these choices on how they're going to operate a business. And particularly, a thing that we're interested in is family partnerships and family businesses. As we get started, though, I want to caution our viewers, this is a big subject. So we have whole seminars and courses on this sort of stuff. So we're just going to be hitting some highlights, and this is the beginning of a conversation that we want you to have with your other advisors, your tax advisor, attorney, and so forth. We're also here in California. So Bernie is a California attorney. I'm a California CPA. There are nuances from state to state. And so that's another thing just to be aware of. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So Bernie, when people start a business, most of the time they think, oh, I'm going to incorporate. Is that usually the best choice?
Well, Michael, as you well know, a lot of people come in with preconceived notions, and the answer is no.
Okay.
The answer is that oftentimes they had heard that there should be a corporation, or they heard there should be another form of entity. Their friends may have done it. They may have even read a little bit of material. Mm-hmm. They may be right, mm-hmm. But as you well know, our jobs as advisors are to marshal the facts and come to the best solution for them and give them actually alternatives. Corporations have some unique tax implications, certainly have some protections, but there are other entities in California or in other states that we can use that may be more beneficial to not only them, but the potential of their investors.
Okay. So let's start sort of examining some of the details related to these. And so traditionally, like we just said, particularly, maybe the barber told them, whatever, incorporate, get these types of entities for, particularly, of course, you want to get legal liability protection and so forth. So what is a C corporation? What is an S corporation? And what are they best suited for?
Well, first of all, a corporation in California, as in other states, is an entity that's recognized by the state which has limited liability protection. Mm-hmm. And it has shareholders, and it has a centralized form of management, and it has an ongoing life. Whether a corporation is a C or an S is dependent, as you well know, Michael, from an election, whether they're going to be treated as an S, and that's a form that you send into the Internal Revenue Service. An S corporation is an entity that has pass-through characteristics. What do I mean by pass-through? Well, in a traditional C corporation, General Motors, or a lot of other corporations, the shareholders are not taxed on the income. Mm-hmm. of that corporation. They're taxed on the dividends or liquidating distributions of that corporation when received. With an S corporation, it's different. And as you well know, you file these tax returns and everybody gets a K-1, and an S corporation shareholder all of a sudden sees that they have income. They might not have received any cash, but they have income, because under the Internal Revenue Code and our franchise tax code, or our revenue tax code in California, income of the corporation is treated as being earned by each shareholder in proportion to their shareholding interest. Mm-hmm. With a limited liability company kind of goes one step further in partnerships. They get taxed on also on a K-1 too, but they have passed through to their partners or their members respectively, and they have to pay taxes on that income. LLCs and partnerships are oftentimes best suited for real estate. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is, as you know, is that when a corporation has an asset, if you ever take the asset out, there's a deemed sale. There may not be a real sale to the eyes of the shareholder, but there's a deemed sale. And in that instance, oftentimes somebody can have an appreciated real estate asset, take it out of the corporation for one reason or the other, and all of a sudden they have a taxable event. And as you well know, that's quite a shocking taxable event because they're very upset. LLCs have been found to be good for management companies. They have been found to be good for certain type of venture entities. They've been found to be good for, certainly for real estate, and they've been found good to be useful for small businesses in general. Mm-hmm. And we can go on a little bit and talk about why the small business versus a larger business.
Okay, so we'll get into some more details related to some of these. So I think a real key thing related to corporations in general is that the people who are operating the business can be different people from the people who own the business.
Absolutely.
So you can have investors, and as we said, there's this limited liability aspect, so people will say, well, what does that mean? What it means is that your exposure as far as what you can lose is, unless you make other guarantees, which quite often you do as a small business person, mm-hmm. But anyway, unless you make other guarantees, you're limited to the amount that you actually invested in the business, so typically from buying stock.
If you're a shareholder,
yeah,
or a limited partner, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So anyway,
or a member, excuse me.
Yeah, or a member of an LLC. Okay. So anyway, so this is the idea of the limited liability aspect, and then people may have heard this magic phrase, pierce the corporate veil. So basically, if you're sloppy, mm-hmm. Or if what you've done is considered to be really egregious, there are situations where a judge can sort of put that aside and say, we don't think that you should be protected in this case. But that doesn't happen very often. I mean, in our society, we really give a lot of deference to.
We do, unless you get really sloppy, and some people do. And mm-hmm. One of the benefits of this new, well, it's not as new anymore, but the limited liability company is that you don't have to follow a certain amount of these of formalities, corporate formalities of having meetings. Yeah. But with a corporation, you do.
Yeah.
And if, let's say, you do not have annual minutes, mm-hmm. As you well know, you may have a client knocking on your door saying, I got a tax problem, the IRS or the Franchise Tax Board mm-hmm. saying, what are these distributions? And they can be deemed to be dividends. Oftentimes, the limited liability gets pierced for one of two reasons, well, three reasons. One is not paying attention to the taxing authorities. The second reason is undercapitalization. Mm-hmm. And the third reason is what we call the alter ego theory. And the alter ego theory is basically, to put it in a layman's term, if you're not going to treat your corporation as a corporation, then the court's not going to treat it. But in general, you have to get pretty sloppy.
Yeah. So. Yeah. So anyway, well, what it boils down to, though, is Bernie was saying that you do need to pay attention to some formalities for corporations. So There's supposed to be board of directors meetings. That can be done like on the telephone or whatever, but they're supposed to happen. And there should be votes and other things on certain issues. And again, minutes means just basically recording what happened at the meeting.
Your directors have to be elected. Your officers have to be elected also. You should have a very clear understanding as to what a distribution was or what loans were made or repayments made, so that you don't run afoul with either the creditors or the IRS. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah. And so you want to document things again. So it's best to issue shares. Actually, you can buy little forms for stock, and also then you should have forms that you use for your loans to document it as a legitimate loan.
You know, Michael, one thing I also tell clients is if you focus on it as just housekeeping, I think you're missing a very big opportunity for having your business successful. And that is, there's a reason why corporations have periodic meetings for management. And if you take it seriously, even a sole practitioner, to take the time to sit down and not just do the formalities, but also review your cash flow projections, also review your business plan, you know, create one in the 3 to 5 years, you're going to have a greater likelihood of success and also have a greater likelihood of making more money.
Right. So it's the idea of working on your business instead of just in your business, the Michael Gerber philosophy, if you will. So you want to be an architect and actually making a business that's going to be successful, and hopefully one that will be able to function without you. The other thing, though, is, again, every company that has like publicly traded stock is a C corporation. So an S corporation is limited. Now it's been expanded a lot, but for the most part, S corporations are limited to the number of shareholders that they can have. The idea is it was supposed to be a small business, and it was to facilitate having a corporation if you were a small business and getting that protection. And we've had some expansion for other types of entities since then. Another thing for an S corporation is that you have to have domestic owners. So in other words, if you have a foreign investor, then you have to look at some sort of an alternative form, either a C corporation or a limited liability company. So those are a couple of things to think about. C corporations are nice because of some of the employee benefits that you can have are better in a C corporation. You can have things like medical reimbursement plans, disability plans, and things like that that don't work so well in partnerships.
In the partnerships, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we've sort of gone around that a little bit. So this limited liability company thing, let's expand on it a little bit, because it's kind of a new animal in some ways. Now seems new to you and me because we've been around for a while doing this stuff. You know, there are a lot of people, young people particularly, that are coming around that, oh well, it's always been there, you know. But maybe you can talk a little bit about why did this LLC stuff sort of come about?
Well, it came about from a couple different directions. Certainly didn't come about because the trial lawyers wanted it. But the main reason is that, as you alluded to, the S corporation was a little bit problematic in the older days. As you alluded, there's a limitation in the type of shareholders that can own. There's a limitation in the number of shareholders. Back then, I think it was
one time like 20 or
something. I think it was 20 or 35. I can't remember which. It's so long ago. Then it went to 75, and now it's 100. But the S corporation had that problem of the deemed sale, the potential for that tax. Then you also had the limited partnerships and the general partnerships, and there was a yearning for people, for entrepreneurs or developers, to have an entity that truly had some type of protection. And so the LLC came out in, I think it was 1984. And California, as progressive as we are, we were not very well progressive here. I think we were like the 43rd state to do it. But once we did it, we put it in place, and it really became quite a buzz because it addressed that issue of limited liability and didn't need to have the corporate formalities, and that helped a lot for it.
Yeah. So the surprise element for an LLC, particularly in California, is that we have some taxes and fees that apply to them, and maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, when California did enact the limited liability company, there was a concern for what was called back then revenue neutral legislation, and they didn't want to be having everybody convert themselves into an LLC when there was a lot of corporate tax. So to do so, the state legislature put in the gross receipts tax. And that was a shocker. At first it wasn't a big deal, but it became quite a shocker later on because everybody jumped to an LLC not realizing what it really meant. And the gross receipts tax basically means that you're going to pay taxes categorically in steps based upon your gross receipts, which is different than what we're normally used to, which we all think about as net income. And people all of a sudden went, well, wait a minute, I could have millions of dollars here of revenue, and I might not be making any money.
Right.
And all of a sudden find out that they could be paying as much as $11,726 of tax unnecessarily. And one of the ones that we saw in our business quite quickly was LLCs in say a real estate development or a shopping center, and the owner would go, why am I paying this gross receipts tax? And when we could do it in another format with a limited partnership and eliminate it. So
yeah. So one of the things that we'll be talking about a little bit later is that you can actually combine these entities, and so maybe reduce some of this tax exposure. Mm-hmm. We'll get there in a couple minutes. But what about professionals in California? Can they use LLCs?
No, they can't. There's a group of professionals, including lawyers, including accountants, including architects, and a couple others, that we cannot use the LLCs. California did give us limited liability partnerships, which we can talk about a little bit later, but those entities are restricted. And in essence, what they really were worried about was malpractice coverage and malpractice exposure. So they didn't want the LLC to become a vehicle for avoiding that and making sure that people who are professionals such as you and I to be on the hook for malpractice coverage.
Now, initially, California was saying if you have any sort of a license with California, that you couldn't have an LLC. So like if you're a barber or if you're a contractor, is a big one. Mm-hmm. So a construction contractor, they have to have their state license and so forth. So what's happened in that way? Well,
actually almost 2 years ago, the California legislature finally let construction companies have their LLCs, and it took them a year to put it into place. I don't know why it took that long, but it's now in place, and so contractors can do that. There's a very small group of people who can't be, or types of businesses who can't be an LLC anymore.
So it's basically it's like the same people. We have a special type of corporation that we call a professional corporation, and it's basically the same types of people as I believe that.
Same concept, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the features with limited liability companies, particularly related to real estate, that I'm just going to touch for a minute because the time is flying here, and that is that we can actually have get basis, if you will. In other words, you treat it as having an investment related to some of the liability related to the real estate.
Correct.
And so with corporations, that cannot pass through. So if you bought real estate like in an S corporation, you may be limited on the deductions you could take because you're not considered as having an investment. Mm-hmm. But you can for liabilities, and it has to be non-recourse debt, I believe. But a lot of people feel that any kind of debt inside of a limited liability could be a non-recourse debt. So, yeah. What about state issues?
I was going to say, what's important there also is not just basis.
Yeah.
And you're right, at time's going by, but with an S corporation, one of the problems with S is that the income is proportional to your stock ownership.
Right.
And as you well know, with partnerships, general partnerships, limited partnerships, and limited liability companies, we can have a special allocation,
Right.
which is it's kind of an interesting term, but essentially we can make allocations of incomes or loss or credits or deductions to a particular owner, either earlier or later, as long as there's what's called the substantial economic effect. And the substantial economic effect, for lay people to understand it, is basically if you're going to lose $1 eventually, then you really have a substantial economic effect. So it is very attractive for different types of investors to get an earlier allocation or loss, where the other investors may have different objectives. And it's been very, very useful.
Okay. We've had some issues with California and non-resident owners of, particularly non-resident LLCs. And maybe you can comment a little bit about that, and what's been happening and where it seems to be going.
Well, California, like other states, are now getting very, very aggressive. They, first of all, if you are, at least in the eyes of the Franchise Tax Board, if you are a California resident and you own an LLC that is, say, a Delaware LLC or a Florida LLC that owns land in, say, Delaware or Florida respectively, that California takes a position that you are actually a foreign LLC doing business in California and will assess the gross receipts tax. And that has been quite a surprise to a lot of people. So far, the Franchise Tax Board has been very aggressive on this, and it looks like they're prevailing at least on that issue. There are other areas where foreign LLCs are somehow even touching California, and that's another issue, which is the apportionment rules are far more complicated than this program right now.
Right. Okay. So anyway, so just be aware that when you have this multiple and frankly, folks, you know, I mean, it's a global economy, so you know, you can have these special circumstances, and you need to be aware that California is going to try to suck in whatever gross receipts that they can.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, let's move on a little bit and talk a little bit about partnerships. We got about 5 minutes here, boy, and LLPs and so forth. We've already talked a little bit of it as a pass-through, but maybe we can just sort of hit a couple highlights.
Well, for partnerships, first of all, both in a limited partnership and in a general partnership, somebody's ultimately liable. And that is the general partner in a general partnership, and of course, all general partners in a general partnership are liable, unless, as you will know, unless you put in an entity between, as the general partner, that is a limited entity, limited liability entity, such as corporation, C or an S, or in one instance, in other instances, you might use an LLC. Those entities would at least cap that loss within themselves. The general partnerships and the limited partnerships, again, have the ability to have a special allocation. There's a lot of flexibility to them, and to be quite frank with you, in some instances, people still use general partnerships if they're willing to manage their risk with insurance, dependent upon the type of business.
Right. So I think what I want to highlight a little bit to explain what Bernie was saying is, if you have a limited partnership, again, you can have an LLC, for example, as the general partner.
Absolutely. Commonly used.
Or you could have a corporation as the general partner. But the LLC idea is part of what makes it attractive, because we were talking about the gross receipts tax. So if you have an LLC that owns 5%, 1%
Yeah.
is a general partner, then their share of the gross receipts of the limited partnership should be pretty small.
Very small.
And therefore a very small gross receipts tax, maybe none. Because you start off with about $250,000, I believe, before you start having it apply.
That's right.
So anyway, so this can be an attractive way to go. And so it's something to be thinking about, especially as we got our 3 minutes that are going to be coming up. Maybe talk just really briefly. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about family limited partnerships, even though we don't have much time?
Well, family limited partnerships have been quite useful recently for transferring value from parents to children. And what they basically are doing is taking advantage of what we call minority discounting and discounting for lack of marketability. Which ones are those? Well, one, lack of marketability is you cannot traditionally sell membership interests or partnership interest on like a stock exchange. For marketability, there's who would like to buy an interest, a minority interest, excuse me, in an entity where you don't have any control. And by using those two theories, we've been able to hold down value that is being gifted to the other people. IRS and Franchise Tax Board have been aggressive here. Taxpayers, if they do their homework and have good counsel, they persevere.
Yeah, they do well. Okay, we're about out of time. I just want to highlight, we didn't get into sole proprietorship very much at all. So sole proprietors, instead of having other investors, it's just you. And so you get the deductions on your own income tax return. You're on the hook for everything. And so as an alternative, a lot of people are having single member LLCs that give some liability protection. And so it's another way to go.
I'd say most of my clients are not sole proprietors.
Okay. So what I would say is particularly that the IRS has been, they pick on people who have sole proprietorships.
Sure, they do.
Okay. I think we're about out of time. So I think I'm just going to sort of sum up here. We've got these different entities that we've talked about. Hopefully you'll understand a little bit better about what some of the consequences are of making the decision of doing business in that way. Again, we want you to get tax and legal counsel. We just scratched the surface here. We'll see you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.